Okay, and so the idea here would be to just sort of read through the text together. There is obviously going to be stuff that you have not seen before. That's fine. That's one of the benefits of reading along in Bible software is it'll give us a lot of the information that we need. But this does a couple things. First of all, it's going to give us exposure to the actual text of Scripture instead of kind of made up sentences. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to force us to familiarize ourselves, not necessarily understand, but at least familiarize ourselves with some of these weird accents that show up everywhere, so that when we turn to the Hebrew text, they don't scare us off. It honestly does take some practice to learn how to ignore the accent and pay attention to the vowel sometimes, because these accents show up in exactly the same place that vowels do. And so that's one thing that we'll do. Another thing, since it's right here, is we'll talk a little bit, just a tiny bit about textual criticism and the textual apparatus, because that's something you'll see here. For sure, you'll learn about that in second year Hebrew, but I just want to explain to you what it is in case someone doesn't take second year. You can at least understand what you're looking at. Another thing that it does is it forces us to use context to translate. So there's all kinds of reasons why this will be helpful. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this if there's anything else that we want to cover, but since this was a relatively short chapter, short week, this will be a good time to focus in on reading. So again, we're really paying attention to PL forms as we go through here. I'm going to try as hard as I can not to chase rabbits and go off into all kinds of things. Sometimes it's hard for me to harness my attention on one thing, but I'm going to try to focus on PLs and just sort of translate through here. And as questions come up, interrupt me. As we see something that kind of triggers a thought about something else, stop me. We'll discuss whatever you want to, and we'll just kind of use this as our roadmap for the rest of the time together. So, starting at verse 15 here, the first thing that I notice is almost something that I've kind of memorized this as its own vocabulary word. This form is so common that you don't want to have to parse this out. So the first thing that we see here is Vav, Yod, Hey, Yod. Now this is not Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. This is not the Tetragrammaton, the name of the Lord. This is Vav, Yod, Hey, Yod. This is the Vav relative attached to the jussive form, or the imperfect side form, of Hayah. So we've got the Hey and the Yod of Hey, Yod, Hey, but remember the jussive form, a third Hey, will lose its third root letter. So we're just left with the Hey and the Yod. And of course we've got the Yod here that belongs to the prefix conjugations, namely the jussive / imperfect, and then of course we've got the Vav. If you're wondering, well, aren't we supposed to have a Vav Patak Dagesh? This, I think, was covered ever so briefly, hopefully it was covered, in the chapter on the Vav relative. This is something, and I think actually Futato has a different memory aid for it. I learned this as the Skinnem-Levy rule, and Skinnem-Levy is just the imaginary word to help you remember all of the sounds that this rule applies to. So Skinnem-Levy would be S sounds, K sounds, N sounds, M sounds, Skinnem, and then L sounds, V sounds, and Y sounds, Skinnem-Levy. All of those sounds this rule applies to. And the rule says when you have a Skinnem-Levy sound, so this would be a Y sound, and you expect to find a Dagesh in that letter, but it also has a Shavah, that Dagesh may drop out. Okay, this just has to do with complicated morphology rules that you don't need to worry about. The only reason why I bring it up is in case you see this and you think, well, it can't be a Vav relative because it doesn't have the Dagesh here. Yod is one of those letters that may lose its Dagesh when it has a Shavah. Okay, so all that to say, this is the Vav relative form of Hayah on the imperfect / jussive side. So remember, imperfect tends to indicate future, but the Vav relative tends to invert that. And so the Vav relative on the jussive form of Hayah is a way of setting the scene into the past time. So as soon as I see this, the first thing I think of is we're setting the scene in the past. Okay, so Vayihi hu. Now hu, this means either it or he, and we're not quite sure how it relates to the rest of the sentence, so we have to kind of keep translating here. But I do have my predicate beginning. This verb is part of the predicate. So in my Hebrew sentence, I do begin with the predicate. And then I've got terem. Okay, so terem. I'm not going to hover over a lot of these words because that will bring up, like when I hover here, you'll see way down here a ribbon that kind of gives me the parsing and the lexical form. I want to avoid that. I want to kind of force us to really think about what we're looking at. So terem, this is not a word that I can remember what it means. I'm not even sure if I've learned this word. So this would be a situation where I would jump over to my lexicon and I would just go to tet. Now I want tet reish. All right, I've got tet reish, and then I want tet reish mem. This is terom. Here's tedrem. This is the word that I want. I looked this up. Okay, it's an alternative form of the tedrom that we saw before, and it means not yet, basically. And sure enough, it tells me that Genesis 24:15, it occurs with the perfect. It can mean not yet, which is what this lexicon, when I see this translation here, when I see this citation here, that's telling me that the editors of this lexicon think that this is the translation, gloss, meaning, sense that occurs in 2415. They're saying we don't think it means even, we don't think it means before or even before. We think it means not yet. That's basically what they're saying here. So as I bring that back over here, not yet happened, key law. All right, so that's basically all that I need here. And now that I've kind of walked through here, all I really have to do on this, you know, if you've got software hooked up like this, is I can just double click this word and it will open my lexicon to that entry, so I don't have to search each time. But it's good to practice looking at it. Oh, that's not what I want. Okay, so we'll go back over here. All right, so this is the idea of not yet. I can't really translate any of this yet because I don't have, maybe it means it had not yet happened, but I need to be a little open-minded in my translation still because there's a lot to go and I don't want to jump to conclusions and rule certain things out. So my next word is key law. So key law is a PL. Now I want to ask you guys, how do I know it's a PL? What do you see here that says PL?
Is it the Hiric and the Dogish?
Hiric and the Dogish, exactly. Why don't I have the Hiric Dogish sere? Why don't I have a sere under the lamed? Because that's sort of like the obvious. I mean, it's third person. In the perfect, I might not have a sere in the second and first person, but this is still third person. So where's my sere?
Is it because of the first Dogish?
You're talking about in the cough?
Uh-huh.
The sere would be under here. The reason why I don't have it is because this is a comets he verb, and that is one of the irregularities that the comets he, that the third he verbs bring to the PL perfect. I think this was last week when I did a video conference going through, going through the weak verbs of the PL. I think I ignored this irregularity in the perfect. I think I only looked at the irregularity that you see in the jussive. And so I would have missed this, but because in the perfect, third he verbs without a suffix have to end in comets he, that's why we don't get the sere of the PL here. The good news is that confirms for us that we are in the perfect. So the Hiric and the Dogish tell us we're in the PL form, the PL pattern. The comets he tells us that we're in the perfect. So we've got a PL perfect, and because the perfect is the suffix conjugation, and I don't really have a suffix, there's only one form that would work here, and that is the PL perfect 3ms. So whatever this root means, and I'm hovering, I'm not looking, so you shouldn't either. I'm going to try to not hover here. But this root then would be kaf lamed he. Have we had that root in our vocabulary yet? What does that mean, kaf lamed he?
I think it means cease.
Yeah, to cease. Well, actually, am I right? Or okay, I think there's also a kaf lamed olive. So if you say that, then you've got to be right because you're not going to make a mistake. But
I could be right.
I think there's a kaf lamed olive, but that I think you're right. I don't think that's this one. So if you're right, then this is also the verb that gets used in Genesis 2:1. This is the word that gets used when Yahweh ceases from the work that he had been doing. All right, so let me look here. Kala, this is saying in the PL. Let's look it up here. All right, kala in the cow means to stop or come to an end. So this is the verb we're thinking of. But when it occurs in the PL, it has a different meaning. The meaning changes. It can mean to complete or bring to an end. It can also mean to use up, to consume, or to destroy. So it looks like the PL range of meaning is actually pretty similar to the cow, because cow can mean stop, vanish or fade away, perish, fail, and then the PL also means to complete, to cause something to come to an end, to consume, to destroy. All right, so we've got those senses in our head. We want to bring a pretty broad range of meaning to the text and then let the text tell us what would be the most appropriate match here. So this would be something like either he brought to an end, or he ceased, or he completed, or he finished something. So now when I add it to the meaning here, it might be something like, it had not yet happened that he ended, which is interesting because now when I see this, I'm starting to think maybe before does work here. So we've got this parsed out. We've got the general meanings in our mind. We don't want to land on any yet. We want to let the rest of the context speak. So now looking at the next word, we've got ledaber. Ledaber. Okay, now this is PL also. The problem is we don't have the Hiric Dogish. We have the Patak Dogish. Why do we have a Patak Dogish, Patak under the Dalet with the Dogish in R2 instead of the Hiric here?
Is it that compensatory lengthening?
It's not compensatory lengthening. That would be if this were a guttural and it was not able to take the Dogish. That would result in this lengthening. What we have here is we get the Hiric Dogish on the perfect family. So when we're looking at the perfect conjugation or the participle conjugation, that's when we might, well, I shouldn't say participle, but basically perfect is the Hiric Dogish. When we go to the imperfect side, that's where we get the Patak Dogish. So the imperfect would have if it has a prefix, it would have a prefix and a shavah, and then it would have a Patak in R1, Dogish in R2. The infinitive, which is what this is built on the imperfect, but we just remove the prefix. My daughter just fell off of the bed, and she has a broken leg, so I want to make sure she's okay. Is she all right?
Yeah, she's good.
Okay, we're good.
Just surprised, like we all are.
Okay, so the the infinitive construct is built off of the imperfect form, but it removes the prefix, and so it also removes the prefix vowel, but it retains the R1 patak and the R2 dogish. And just for reference sake, we'll pull that up here. So again, in the PL, we see hirik dagesh, hirik dagesh, hirik dagesh, hirik dagesh, hirik dagesh. In the imperfect, we get the reduced vowel in the prefix, but then we get patak dagesh, patak dagesh, patak dagesh all the way through. In the infinitive construct, we're just removing this prefix. Let me go up here to 3ms. And so we would be left with katail. And sure enough, we get down here, katail is the form. So this then is PL. It's just on the imperfect side, the imperfect, whichever side. It's on the imperfect side. Specifically, it's an infinitive construct. We know it's an infinitive construct and not an imperative because an imperative would not have a lamed preposition on it. So this lamed preposition plus infinitive construct, this would basically be translated as to speak. So again, adding that to what we have here, I'm thinking along the lines of, it had not yet happened that he stopped speaking. He stopped to speak. Again, the English gerund, which again, gerund is a way of, it's a verbal noun. And English has two verbal nouns, a gerund and an infinitive. Hebrew only has one, the infinitive. And so the infinitive does in Hebrew what the gerund and the infinitive do in English. So this is almost like the direct object of kala. I'm thinking, I have to get through the rest of the sentence, but I'm thinking this is probably what did he stop? What did he cease? To speak. He ceased to speak. He ceased speaking. All right, ve'heneh. So now I've got a conjunction and I've got a particle of attention. This tells me I've probably got a new clause. All right, so I can stop here and probably just translate this as its own clause. This as an independent clause. So my guess is the translation would be something like, he had not yet, and it happened that, he had not yet stopped speaking when, behold, when, lo, when, all of a sudden, Rivka. Now, Rivka, this is a form that I do not recognize. This is something I would have to look up. But I've got a hint. First of all, if I ignore the vowels and I just look at r, v, k, h, that gets a couple words in my head. Then I look over here at the context, Genesis 24:15. I start to think, this might be the word Rebecca. Now, as I hover, noun, proper noun, feminine, singular, absolute, Rebecca. Sure enough. Okay, so behold, Rebecca. This is probably the subject of a new clause. So Rebecca's probably doing something. Next word, I've got yotzeit. All right, yotzeit. This is a little bit tricky, but I think we can figure it out. There is a verbal root in here. This is not a PL, but the first thing I notice when I see this word is the vowel pattern holam sere. So the yod has a holam, the tsade has a sere. That makes me think participle, cal-active participle. Now, if it is a cal-active participle, that means that the yod is the first root letter, the tsade is the second root letter, and the aleph is the third root letter, which means that I have yatsa. And that is a verb that we've learned. Yatsa means to come forth, to come out. My memory aid is a Yahtzee barrel. The dice come forth from the barrel. Yatsa, Yahtzee. So to come out. Now I got to figure out what's happening with this tav here. Because it's on a participle, so I know this isn't, for example, the tav ending that might show up on a one yod vav infinitive construct, because it's not an infinitive construct, it's a participle. So because it's a participle, this tav ending means it's feminine, because it's either a singular feminine tav ending or a plural holam vav tav ending. There is no holam vav, so this must be the feminine singular ending, and it is most likely modifying Rebecca. So because they're both feminine singular. So this is something like, and all of a sudden, Rebecca coming out. Now, henna, this is another point where we have to ask, what is the function of henna here? Because we've learned several functions that henna can have. Henna can mean, it can be the particle of attention. Behold, lo, look what, all of a sudden, something like that. Or when it's used with a participle, it can have that feeling of imminence. Rebecca was about to, or Rebecca is about to, or something like that. I need to have both of those in my mind as I continue, because when I get to the end, I'm going to have to make a decision about which one makes more sense of the context. I'm tempted at this point to side with the particle of attention, because the context is saying, basically, someone had not even stopped speaking, and all of a sudden is what I want to say here. So I'm leaning towards the particle of attention, but because I have that participle, I have to be open about maybe this means someone had not yet finished speaking, and Rebecca was about to come out. Something like that, okay? Next word, assure. This is my relative pronoun, which means that not everything, but the next words are going to be their own relative clause. So let's figure out what we have here. We have assure, and then we have, again, I'm trying not to hover, so I'll go above it. Maybe, can I go down here? Yeah, okay, so it's the word way above. All right, so we have yulada. Now this is interesting because this is a form related to the PL, but it is not the PL. We can see part of the PL in that dagesh. That dagesh is in the second root letter. So yod is our first root letter, Lamed is our second root letter, and Dalet is our third root letter. This is Yalad. But, and since this is Yalad, and it's got a Comet Hey ending, we can be pretty sure that this is the perfect, the PL perfect 3FS form. But again, it's not PL, because PL would have a Hirik under the Yod. And we don't have a Hirik, we have a Shur, or I'm sorry, we have a Kibbutz. The Kibbutz is the sign of the passive version of the PL. We call this the Pual. All right. So in maybe a couple more weeks, maybe we'll learn passive forms. This is a passive form of the PL. So Yalad means, well, here it's Yaladas. This would be she bore or she gave birth. And in the passive, it would mean something like she was given birth or she was born. But that's a little unusual because we've got the third hey, the Comet Hey here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look this verb up in my lexicon, and I'm going to go specifically to the Pual entries and see what it means in the Pual. So here's the PL. It means to help give birth. Okay, here we go. So PL differs from the Cal in that the Cal means to give birth to, or to beget when the subject is a male. In the Nifal, this is the passive form of the Cal. It means to be born. But when we get to the PL, it doesn't mean to give birth. It means to help in the process of giving birth. So here, the participle would be someone who helps giving birth. They would be a midwife. Okay, but when this goes passive, it basically reverts back to the same thing as the Nifal, I guess. The same thing as the passive version of the Cal, because whether you are the passive of being born or you're the passive of someone helping you be born, either way you're being born, I guess would be the way that works. So the Pual does mean she was born. Oh, I'm sorry, this is referring back to Rebecca. So behold, Rebecca was coming out, Rebecca who was born to, all right, so now we've got, again, I'm trying not to hover here. We've got the Lamed preposition on the Beit, Tav, Shurik, Aleph, Lamed. This is, if you didn't see, this is a proper name. This is Betuel. And so Le Betuel would be to Betuel. All right, so Betuel, the father of Laban. So father of Laban, not the father of Rebecca, apparently, but either way. Come on. So who was born, again, this is feminine because Rebecca is the subject of it. Rebecca was coming out, who was born to Betuel, ben Milcah, son of Milcah. All right, who, now Milcah is probably the subject, who, I'm sorry, Eshet, wife. This is Eshet, wife of Nahor, Ahi, brother. So this is a long chain kind of describing the relationships here. Rebecca was born to Betuel, son of Milcah, wife of Nahor, brother of Avraham, Kad something. So it must be like Kadah. So Kaf, Dalet, Hey, and the Hey drops out. That's what I'm thinking here. So I'm going to go to my lexicon and I'm going to look up Kadah. But since I have software and I obviously know how to look up something in a lexicon, I'm going to take a shortcut and I'm just going to double click here. All right, so Kad, this is not a verb at all. Okay, it tricked me because it had the Patak Dagesh. That made me think it was PL. This is just a noun. All right, so this means pitcher, and the Comet Hey ending would mean her pitcher. And her pitcher upon Shichma. Shichma would be upon her Shecham. I don't know what Shecham is here. Shechem. Shechem means upon her shoulder. Okay, so let's translate through that now that we know what all the words mean. So this is something like, this is an idiom. If we translate this literally, it's not going to make a lot of sense. It would be something like, it happened, not yet he finished to speak, which basically means he had not yet finished speaking when, again, I think this makes sense as a particle of attention, when all of a sudden Rebecca was coming out, Rebecca who was born to Betuel, son of Milcah, wife of Nahor, brother of Abraham, and her pitcher, here we have a verbless clause, her pitcher upon her shoulder, or upon her back, her pitcher was upon her back. Okay, so that's a lot of work for one sentence here, but this is basically the idea. Thankfully, we had a bunch of relationship words here that got us through it pretty quickly, but not a great example sentence because there's a lot of idioms here. But again, the PLs that we saw here were Kila. Again, Hirik Dagesh tells us we're on the perfect side, so this is a PL perfect. Then we get to Daber, and the Patak Dagesh tells us that we're on the imperfect side. So this is going to be an infinitive, which is basically the imperfect minus the prefix, daber. And then what else do we have here? We've got our participle, but that's a cal. Here we have not a PL, this is called a pual, and it's the passive form of PL that we'll learn later. But you can see the dagesh in R2 of yalad. And that's it as far as verbs go. So, okay, so again, first thing I try to do when I start here is in a Hebrew sentence, I'm going to expect, I'm going to anticipate, I'm not going to demand, but I'm going to anticipate that we're starting with a predicate. So that's either going to be like a verbless clause, a predicate adjective, predicate participle, or a verb. And so I'm thinking verbal roots or adjectives as I begin, and I get to bako here. Now bako, this is kind of a funky vowel combination, but I do recognize the letters. This is from baka, which means he wept. And this particular orientation cannot, well, okay, so if I didn't know this root at all, I might think, well, this is a cal perfect stative verb, because some stative verbs like yakol can have this holum, but I already know that baka is not a stative verb. I know the lexical form is kamate. So when would I have a holum theme vowel, a holum R2 vowel? Well, that's commonly my theme vowel in the imperfect, but when I'm in the imperfect, I have a prefix, and I don't have that here. So when else do I have it? Well, I would have it in the infinitive, but the infinitive construct usually has a shava in R1. Why would this inflate to a kametz? Well, this isn't the infinitive construct, this is the infinitive absolute, which means all of a sudden I have to just say, okay, we're going to put a hold on it. I can't translate this until I'm pretty much done with the sentence, but I will note that it's an infinitive absolute. And so now I'm looking for a cognate form. That is to say, I'm looking for another form of this root that the infinitive absolute is attaching to or modifying. And sure enough, the very next word is baka. This is the lexical form. This is the form that I'm used to seeing in my vocabulary list. This is the cal perfect 3ms form, and it means he wept. So what the infinitive absolute does, especially when it's attached to an imperfect or to a perfect, is it usually brings some sort of like, I hate to say emphasis, because that's just not the right word, but you can think of it as like an intensifier. And so the example that Futato, I think, has given us is to use the word surely or certainly, modifying the main verb. And so if the main verb is he wept, then it would be something like he certainly wept, or let me just come down here. He certainly wept, he surely wept, he truly wept, something like that. And that will give us the translation of this phrase. Now I have my key conjunction here, and the key is usually going to function one of two ways. Key is either going to introduce content, which means it's usually following a verb of speaking or a verb of thought, giving the content of that speech or the content of that thought, or key is going to introduce some sort of explanatory clause, something that explains the main clause or explains the independent clause that it's related to.
So quick question about that.
Go ahead.
I had memorized key as basically because or for, but I thought, especially when I was going through the quiz, I thought that I had heard in our lessons last week that it could also be translated when, and did I totally make that up, or is that sometimes?
It would be possible. It would be possible to see an English translation of this sentence where I wouldn't translate key as when, but it would be possible to see when in that English sentence and not see another translation of key. And I will show you what that would look like once we get through here.
Okay.
It's rather interpretive, but it's possible. And so I'll show you what that looks like. What I would say is you memorize key as because or for. There's one other important sort of word to keep in there as well. Because and for are really kind of the same thing. Because is going to indicate what the cause of the independent clause is. For is a little bit broader. For is going to be more explanatory. So cause would be sort of a subset of explanation. So if you're gonna have because and for memorized, that's really only covering one sense of key. The other important sense is that content sense. And usually if you're going to translate key when it's marking content, you would translate it that. So he said that such and such. So that would be the other one. But oftentimes when key is indicating content, we don't translate it at all. Now the only way the key would be content here is if the rest of this sentence, or at least what immediately follows key, is what he's weeping. So if he's weeping words, then it would make sense as content. But baka doesn't usually get used as a verb of speech. It's really more just the action of weeping. So key then is going to be that explanatory clause that we will translate either as for or because. So he certainly, he truly, he surely wept. Why did he weep? For, again, for isn't the best, especially when it's cause. For can give you the sense that he's weeping on behalf of someone. He's weeping for them, like an empathetic sort of weeping. That is not what key is doing. Key is indicating the reason or giving an explanation for why he's weeping, not indicating like he's not weeping for the benefit of someone. Okay, so anyways, he certainly, surely, truly wept because shalach. Okay, so shalach is going to be sent. Now, if we don't have an explicit subject, then we'll have to infer the subject from the form of the verb, which would be he here. But again, standard Hebrew word order is going to have verb and then subject, and that's what we have here, the prophet. So the prophet sent. Since we have an explicit subject, we don't need he on shalach. He wept because the prophet sent. What did the prophet send? Well, we would know that sefer is the direct object if we had the definite direct object marker et or eight, but we don't have that. If sefer is the direct object, why don't we have that? Well, the reason why we don't, and sefer is the direct object, the reason why we don't is because sefer is indefinite. It's not the book or scroll or letter or document. He sent a document, and then rasha here is an adjective describing sefer. It occurs after its noun, and it also agrees indefiniteness. Sefer is indefinite, rasha has no article, so this would be attributive. He sent a wicked document, letter, book, whatever. He sent a wicked document, and then we have a lav here. And so this is the L preposition with the third person masculine singular object suffix here. So to him. Now, if you're like me, the first thing you're asking is, why on earth is this a lav instead of L lav? Did anybody wonder that? Okay, I'm hoping there's an explanation for that, and I'm hoping that the explanation is not, this is a typo. Because there's a lot of typos that I've dealt with this semester. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up Futato, and I'm going to hope against hope that he inflects L so that we can see what the form is. And actually, you know what? The best way to do this is actually just to go to the lexicon. We're going to go to the L preposition, and we're going to look at its form. Okay, so this is, I don't know what the explanation is, but we do see here that when it takes a, here we go, a lav. This is the form we're looking at. So when it takes, oh, and I do know the reason. I think I do. This has to do with one of the, rules of Hebrew vowel length and syllabification. But in Hebrew, when you have a two-syllable word, a lav, and the emphasis is on the final syllable, the syllable before that is what we call pre-tonic. And when you have an open pre-tonic syllable, that syllable wants to have a long vowel. And so the segel of L, which would be a, L itself is a closed syllable, but when we add this suffix, the lamed all of a sudden jumps onto this syllable, and the aleph is left open. That, in that situation, Hebrew wants to have a long, open pre-tonic syllable, and so that's why you get sere there. So hey, I did, sorry. I just started myself. I see out my window here that someone's spraying my house, and it's our pest control people. So I just freaked out a little bit, but we're good. Nobody's breaking in, I think. All right. So anyways, that's why you get the sere here, is because this is now open and pre-tonic, and so it wants to be long. But this is the idea, is the subject of the sentence itself is he. The sentence, the main clause, the independent clause, is basically he truly wept, he surely wept, he certainly wept. And even if you said he wept, I mean, I'll be pretty flexible on how you translate this wept part. Again, with emphasis and intensity, I don't really want it to be he wept a lot, because that would be built differently in Hebrew. But this idea of intensifying his weeping, he wept truly. Then we get the explanatory clause marked by the key. Why did he weep? Because now we've basically got another Hebrew sentence built in. This embedded clause here, we've got our verb. Now this is not the main verb, this is the dependent clause, this is the dependent verb. But again, it's he sent, who sent, subject. The prophet sent. What did he send? A wicked book, not the wicked book, that's why we don't have 8, but he sent a wicked book, and then we've got elav. What does elav do? It modifies his sending. Where did he send it? Elav, to him. All right, what was tricky? Where do you think you stumbled? Any questions about that one?
Yeah, I think, like I said, the big thing was I saw that definite article in front of prophet, and for some reason it threw me, because I wasn't sure if the prophet was sending something, or if the just where to put the prophet as a proper noun in the sentence. The other thing that threw me, I will say, is and now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, I don't know why that confused me, but the sefer was one. I guess the different form was one of our vocab that was report. And that threw me for a loop, because I was like, that's a verb. So I'm trying to make reporting or telling a part of what the prophet was doing.
Well, there is a typo here. that
Not that I
you've
translated it as
inadvertently.
report.
Yeah, this shouldn't be sefer. Let me see if sefer is even a word. This should be sefer with a sere because it's not in construct. But let me see what the construct form is, because Rasha could be a noun maybe too, or at least a substantival adjective. So let me look up sefer and look at what its forms are. But either way, points are coming back on this because of the typo. Let me pull up.
Because I guess I was thinking that was the word for report, or he told, and that being a verb threw me, because I was trying to fit that in, and finally I kind of gave up, and I was like, maybe report could also be a noun, like a bad report instead of a bad, a wicked letter. But I was trying to make the prophet report something wicked, and it just wasn't working.
Well, and you've got, the sentence that you translated, report is a noun in your sentence. I'm trying to
Right.
figure out what it was that, because I took 3 points off, and I can see where I would have taken 2 off, but I'm trying to figure out where the third point was. So maybe I took too much off anyways. But what you've got here, the prophet.
Well, I usually translate, every other time I translate key as because, and for some reason, I was, like I had said, I thought that we had gone over, it could be when.
Yeah, it is the word report.
Yeah.
Just because the word for report, there's a different word for what a report is. This is not necessarily a report. This is just a document. So it was
Right.
1, the when, instead of because, 2, report instead of document, and 3 would have been the against. And that one was really hard because I didn't know whether or not, I think that the word that should be used here if it's against would be al instead of el. But basically that's where it came from. But because this has a typo in, and again, sorry, I get distracted here. Let me make sure this is actually a typo, because if it is, I'm just going to give full credit on it anyways. Sefer. Okay, I want to see if the construct is sefer. Because often segulate nouns don't reduce. But I don't see a construct listed anywhere. Yep, we're calling it a typo. So I'm going to go back through everybody's quiz and give full credit on that one. And then I need to make a note that this is misspelled. Let me do that real quick. Sorry to take up the time with this, but if I don't do it now, I'll forget about it. Okay, any other questions on that translation? I got about, at least, I could go as much as another 25 minutes just working through those translations, but I want to make sure that that's, what works for you guys. So if there's no other questions, I'll just keep going. All right. You guys can see the Hebrew up here in Word, correct? Okay. I'm not always sure if I'm sharing a screen or just a window. So, all right. So this one here, we've got avo. Let me get rid of the squigglies. And I hate that it cuts off the vowels, but we'll figure it out. So, avo la sadeh ve'asafti mencha. All right, so this one here, we begin with avo. Avo is a little weird looking, but what I notice is bow in there. And then I've got an aleph prefix, which tells me I'm probably in the cal perfect of what would be a hollow verb. And of course, I'm used to seeing aleph segel as my prefix in the imperfect, but I do know that these hollow verbs in the imperfect, they do lengthen that segel into a comet. So everything looks good there. This is basically I will go, or I will enter, I will go in, something like that. Then we've got la sadeh. Okay, and the first thing I notice here is the lamed patak dagesh at the beginning of this word. That looks like a lamed preposition with a definite article. If I take that off, I'm left with sadeh, which is the word, this is a vocabulary word we have for field, or it could be like pasture land or something like that. So I will go to the field, because we've got the definite article. I will go to a field. Then we've got a vav with a soft T. Now we've flipped. We began with the imperfect conjugation, but asafti, this is asaf, which means I gathered, or he gathered. The T means I gathered. We've got this vav with the shavah here. Now you would think, maybe, that because we see the vav relative with the imperfect / jussive so often, that when we see a vav with a shavah, we might think, well, this can't be the vav relative because it's not a vav patak dagesh, or in this case, it's not a vav kametz because the aleph can't take the dagesh. But what you have to remember is that the vav relative on the perfect actually looks like a vav shavah. It doesn't do the patak dagesh. And so because there's no difference in spelling, you have to ask yourself, is this just a simple vav conjunction and I gathered, or is this a vav relative where we're inverting the time? Instead of I gathered, this would be I will gather. And spelling-wise, it could be either, but translation-wise, it can't. We can't say I will go to the field, or I will go into the field, and I gathered, because that we're flipping time there. That's not a coherent sentence. The only way this makes sense is if this is a vav relative, which is inverting the time of the perfect tense here, or the perfect form. So we need to translate this as I will enter into the field, I will enter to the field, and I will gather mincha. Mincha here is the word for a gift, but it usually gets used for like a grain offering or something like that, or an offering. So the translation here should be, I will enter to the field, I will go into the field, and I will gather a grain offering. Now I'll note that in the answer key on the quiz, this was translated as, what would be, I guess, sequential action. This was translated as then. The vav here was translated as then. I by no means expect you guys to translate the vav here as then. That is second year stuff. When you have a vav relative, there are probably 10 to 15 different functions that vav relative can be fulfilling. And to translate this as then would be to pick a specific function. Well, you guys haven't even really learned most of those functions yet. So I am perfectly fine with you leaving the vav here as and. I will go into the field and I will gather a gift or a grain offering, because that's more general anyways. But that's the idea here. Any questions about this translation? Okay, so this next translation here, we have ana. Again, this is a lexical form. This is a verb that I recognize from my vocabulary. Ana means he answered. So we've started with our predicate, perfectly regular Hebrew sentence. Since this is third person, I may have an explicit subject. And if I do, that would usually come right after the main verb. Sure enough, I have ha'ish. Ha'ish fits as a 3ms explicit subject. And so we have the man answered. And then I see my definite direct object marker, et. So I know that this is going to be marking whom or what did the man answer. The man answered Yahweh. So you can translate this Yod He Vav He here. You can translate this as Yahweh. You can translate it as the Lord if you want to. Don't translate this as God. This is not the word for God. Translate this either as Yahweh, the Lord, or you can translate it as Adonai if you want to, because that is what, I used to not really want you to do Adonai because that's not a translation, that's just another Hebrew word, but it's used enough in English that I will accept either Yahweh, the Lord, or Adonai here. So the man answered Yahweh, and then we've got Vav Patak Dagesh. So we've got another Vav relative here. If I take the Vav Patak Dagesh off, I get Yitain. Now again, Yitain, this is that Natan form that is so tricky. I've got a Yod-Heric prefix, which tells me that I'm in the imperfect, and my one noon has assimilated into R2. So Natan, that first noon assimilates into the Tav, and we're left with Tain. Now, one of the irregularities of Natan as a verb is that in the imperfect, this theme vowel, instead of a holum or a patak that I'm used to in the imperfect, Natan prefers this sere. And so in the, for example, in the imperative, it's just going to be tate. In the, I think even in the infinitive, it's tate as well. So Natan is a very unusual verb. And now that I'm thinking about it, let me pull something up here. In the Hebrew vocabulary spreadsheet, if you look along the bottom, I've got the Hebrew vocabulary with memory aids, and then I've got a tab on Ra'ah versus Yirah. You'll notice that Ra'ah, the first two letters of that root, are Resh Aleph, and the Hey often drops off. In Yirah, the second two, Resh and Aleph, are the same two, and the Yod often drops off. So the forms between Ra'ah and Yirah can often be very confusing. So I'm working on listing those out here. But right next to that, this is the conjugated forms of Natan. And the reason why I provided this is because Natan is one of those verbs where it's just easiest to memorize its forms. So infinitive, tate, and naton, imperative, tain, tani, tanu, taina. It's just easier to memorize the forms of Natan if you have trouble with them. So I made that available there along the bottom. I've tried to include a bunch of helpful stuff. Some of this I'm still working on, but it's there for you if it's helpful. All right, so Natan, the man answered Yahweh, and now Natan is he gave, so Yitain would be he will give in the imperfect, but again, the Vav relative is going to invert he will give back to he gave. And he gave, what did he give? Et ha-olah. Olah here is a very particular word. I have some students that have translated this as offering. Offering is not a precise enough translation of olah. Olah is a specific type of offering. It's the burnt offering. I've got a very weak memory aid for this. Olah, that ol, I think of whole. Olah, whole. I know that's weak, but that's what I've got. So whole burnt offering is the translation of olah. It's a very specific type of offering. And he gave the burnt offering ba mizbeach. Oh boy, well, there should be a dagesh here. So ba mizbeach, at the altar. When you have he gave in this context of an offering at the altar, you can translate Natan as he offered, I would not translate Natan as he sacrificed, just because that's stretching Natan a little bit. Natan is putting forth. He is setting down. He is placing. He's giving. He's offering. Sacrifice is a little bit more where you're going to need zavah here. But if you just translate Natan as give, that's perfectly fine too. So if we put all this together, we can say, the man answered the Lord, and he gave the whole burnt offering, or the burnt offering, at the altar. Or you could even, if you want to, you can say on the altar. On would probably be al, because when you say on the altar, what you really mean is upon the altar. But I'm not going to count you off if you said on the altar. But at the altar is probably the best translation here. If you said in the altar, I shouldn't give you credit for it, because even though the bait preposition can mean in, he did not put it inside the altar. He put it at, or he gave it at the altar. So I probably didn't count you off if you translated bait as in here, but that's not a good translation. So anyways, any questions on this translation? We'll deal with, you know what, we'll deal with all these quickly because they're related. So these two are related in that they have the, again, this is that form that for me is just sort of like, I've memorized it as a form. When I see this form, I know that it's the vav relative version of the verb haya. And so I know that this is basically, this begins a sentence by setting it in the past. So you could literally translate it as, and it happened that. But honestly, if you just leave this untranslated, you're usually going to be okay. The tricky part here is the key. And I'm not sure if the key even really belongs here. I think the idea was for you to translate this as, it happened that he went, who went? The prophet. The prophet went. Where did he go? El Ha'ir. He went to the town, or to the city. So the prophet went to the city. Vayavosh, this is bosh, and it's imperfect. Okay, so it is imperfect. It's not jussive, because the jussive of a hollow verb gets reduced. So it can't be jussive, but why are you putting a vav relative on the non-jussive form? It doesn't work. Now, maybe I'm wrong, because I certainly do not know Hebrew as well as the people who put this course together. But if I'm not wrong, if this should be something like, oh gosh, what would it be? Maybe Yavosh without the vav, maybe Yavush. I'm not sure, I'd have to look it up. But I don't think this whole vav is supposed to be here if we have a vav relative. So that's another thing I need to correct and give credit for. I'll come back to that. But if this were the vav relative form, it would be, and Ha'am was ashamed, were ashamed. Ha'am is the subject of Yavosh, the people were ashamed. So, and it happened that the prophet went or walked to the town or the city, and the people were ashamed. That's how we translate that. This one is sort of similar, and it happened bayom, in the day, that one. It happened in that day. Again, I'm not sure if we're supposed to have the shurik here. Vayamut, so he died or it died. Hayam is the subject. The people died, the unclean. So in that day, the unclean people died. And I know I'm translating this as a plural, even though it's singular and the verb is singular, but that's because is a collective noun. So it is a people. And unclean people died. The unclean people died. All right. These two are similar because they have the yesh. So what we've got here is yesh melech tov. Yesh, there is, melech tov, a king, a good. There is a good king. We know that we think this is attributive because, first of all, the definiteness of the noun matches the missing article of the adjective. So there's a match there, which would be attributive, and the adjective comes after its noun, which would indicate attributive. There is a good king in the city, the good. Tovah here, the comma te, because ir, even though it looks masculine, ir is feminine. So we have a feminine adjective. And we know that this is attributive because the definiteness of the noun, it has the article, even though the bait is covering the hay. We can see the article in the comments, which is lengthened from a patak because the ayin can't take the dagesh, matches the article of the adjective. So the good city. There is a good king in the good city. And then this yesh, there is lamed patak. Guys, I can't change I can't go in and fix this stuff. I have to type it all out, send it, and trust that someone else is going to fix it. And until they do, I have to see these every semester. This should have a dagesh, la kohen. There is for or to the priest, a son, a wicked, or a guilty one. All right, so this, the first thing that you need to be able to do is identify everything here. But again, translation is not done until you build the sentence the way English would build it. English would not say, there is for the priest a wicked son. English would say, the priest has a wicked son. So this is how Hebrew designates indefinite possession, but English doesn't designate indefinite possession this way. So even though it's literally, there is to the priest a wicked son, your translation should say, the priest has a wicked son. All right. I think that's all of them. Any other questions? Anything else to cover in the next 5 minutes?
Yeah, if you don't mind, real quick, and I know this is going back like weeks, but I seem to always miss it. Is there a really quick, easy way to differentiate, and I know there is, and I just always miss it, between the infinite construct and infinite absolute?
Yeah.
It seems like I always go one way or the other, and it's always wrong.
Yeah, there is a very easy way to distinguish between them. Let me pull up Futato and point it out to you.
I know we had like the construct and absolute, but
yeah,
it either didn't stick, or I learned it wrong, or I don't know.
I gotta figure out where maybe I closed Futato. Figure out where I put him. All right, let's just go to that chapter. And it's kind of a two-part thing to really get everything. Oh boy. Okay. So the first thing that I would say is, if the form you're looking at has either a preposition attached to the front of it, or a pronoun suffix attached to the end of it, it cannot be the infinitive absolute.
Okay.
It is the construct that has things attached to it. So first of all, the infinitive absolute has to be sort of an independent form. It can't have any prepositions attached to the front, or it can't have any suffixes attached to the end. I hesitate to say it can't have prefixes, because technically we will get in when we get into the hifil and the nifal, the infinitive absolute is going to technically have a type of a prefix, but that prefix is part of the stem or the pattern. It's not a separate word attached to it. So the only form that can have other words attached to it is the infinitive construct. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The second thing that's much more kind of obvious to distinguish between them is that the construct form is going to have a reduced vowel in R1. It's going to have a shavah, again, unless a preposition forces a vowel change or something like that. The infinitive absolute will not have a reduced vowel there. The infinitive absolute will almost always have that full kametz. So that right there. Now, I would say the infinitive absolute will have a holum vav instead of a holum, but that's not universal. Sometimes the infinitive absolute will just have a regular holum. The place where you really tell the difference is in the R1 vowel. If the R1 vowel is reduced, it is infinitive construct. If the R1 vowel is a kametz, and there's no prefixes or suffixes attached to it, because the tricky part is when you get to an infinitive construct that has a pronoun suffix, what happens is you have to reduce this theme vowel that has the holum, and as a result you have to lengthen. You have to expand the R1 vowel, and it will expand into a kametz chatuf, which would look exactly like a kametz. But that's the only time that an infinitive construct is going to not have the shavah here, is if you've got a pronoun suffix attached, and this holum has reduced to a shavah, then that O quality that you see in the holum, it wants to get out because it's an infinitove. It wants to get out, and so the infinitove, the O quality of this reduced holum, because you've got the pronoun suffix, is going to pop back out in R1, not as a holum, and not as a kametz, but as a kametz chatuf, which is that short O-class vowel. And the only reason it works there as an O-class vowel is because the accent is over here, so it's unaccented, and it's closed. It's a closed syllable, because the ta or the tet here is going to close that, and the lamed is going to connect with whatever the suffix is. That's a ton of information, but it covers everything. If you want a tiny bit of information that covers almost everything, so you can have a ton of information that covers everything, or you can have a tiny bit of information that covers not everything but a lot, I would go with, if it's got the kametz in R1, it's infinitive absolute. If it's got the shavah in R1, it's infinitive construct. That is the easiest way to tell them apart.